Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, this is going to be part 2 of our discussion on methods defense. And so in our last discussion, we were wrapping up this conversation about how do we tell people a story behind a statistical method. So perhaps from my ice cream example with WWE, you were able to glean a few things here. So for one, if you're going to tell a story to help explain what a statistical technique or method may be, pick something that everybody's familiar with. It's really important to think about something that people enjoy, people like, people can relate to. It makes the storytelling easier. I think the second thing is to make sure that you understand the statistical technique. It forces you to really have a clear train of thought when you are describing, presenting, explaining a regression, a factor analysis, a conjoint, cluster analysis, whatever it may be, so that the audience has confidence in you as well. And you should rise to the occasion when you're given these opportunities. You get to become more intimate with the technique and build out an expertise that can be exploited in your career. I think another thing to be mindful of when you're doing this is to make sure that your slides are clear. Absolutely lucid, absolutely easy to interpret, and easy to understand so that nobody really needs you to explain anything. Because remember, especially in business, any kind of deck that we make will be chopped up, torn apart, given to different departments, right? Maybe even given highlights of. So somebody may take a business presentation that you have, take 3 slides of it and send it to finance, or take 2 slides and send it to marketing. So you just want to be sure that you have a very easy to understand explanation. It's crystal clear, it's not complicated, there's not a lot of text, because again, you may not always be around to explain it. And so you want to be sure that the research method that you're presenting is crystal clear. So in this portion of the lecture, we're going to be looking at different examples. I'm going to be presenting a structural equation model, and I will show you different ways that you can present it based on the stats background of your audience. And again, thinking really about how to explain statistical techniques to people as a spectrum. You know, it's not whether or not somebody has a stats background. Most people wind up falling into the middle. And so there are multiple ways in which we can use images, we can use color, we can beautify the explanation so that it's appealing. Yes, everybody should listen to every word that we say during a business presentation, but we know that it usually doesn't happen. And so the best that we can do is we can try to give something that's aesthetically pleasing, engaging, entertaining for our audience. So let's get started. So, multiple linear regression is one thing I am laying out as a challenge to those who are watching this. And I anticipate I have many of my Masters of Science and Business Analytics students, some of my MBA students, and perhaps some of my former students at St. John's University and even at CUNY LaGuardia Community College as well. So I know I may have people from all avenues. But in thinking about this particular lecture, you know, linear regression is something that's fairly basic when it comes to multivariate analysis. What is a multiple linear regression? How can we formulate a story around that for people who may not understand it? Multiple linear regression. It's a mouthful. Those of us who run analytics take it for granted, but for many people, that's a mouthful. That stops people in their tracks. How would we tell a story? Well, when we think about multiple linear regression, we think about looking at how several independent variables predict variability in a dependent variable. So it's this idea that a dependent variable may go up or down based on an independent variable. And so if we think about outside, well, it's a beautiful day. This is being shot in May. We can think about maybe how many clothes people have on. Okay, so if our dependent variable was how many articles of clothing people were wearing, right? We could say some independent variables that may influence that could be temperature, could be daylight, could be wind, could be time of day. We begin to see that there may be 3 or 4 independent variables that can predict how many clothes or how many articles of clothing people wear and how few articles of clothing people wear, right? That might go up or down based on the temperature outside, based on the daylight outside, based on the wind. But what about all of those variables together? Linear regression helps us account for different independent variables and their influence on a dependent variable. It's useful because it's important to see which independent variables are most impactful on the dependent variable to help us understand and anticipate which variables may be important in the future. So, if I am outside and I am selling sweatshirts of, I don't know, the New York Knicks, I probably wouldn't do it on a day like today. It's actually about 72 degrees outside. It is gorgeous, super sunny and bright. I'm probably not going to be doing that because the variables illustrate that when temperature is up, daylight is high, the wind is low, there are people who are wearing fewer articles of clothing and are likely not interested in buying a sweater. And so when you think about why this is useful, how you would explain this to a non-business analytics person, we begin to see that you can weave a story around a technique that really does make it innocuous, that really does make it palatable, that really does make it interesting and engaging for people to want to know more. This is a great way to really distill down what a technique is without talking about betas and coefficients and statistical techniques or statistical significance and p-values. That stuff, though important, may really not be relevant when we're trying to explain just why we're doing a method, why we've executed a method, why we've engaged in something that we think will help us get toward actionable insights. As a business person, you can figure out whether or not to sell sweaters outside on a hot day versus a cold day by running regressions. That's the use for it. That story is way easier for many, many people to follow. And again, this is a critical portion of your statistical methods defense because we want to be sure that we don't leave anybody behind in the beginning. And so it's really, really important to think about what do people relate to, what's a simple example, why is this useful, and would my aunt or aunt understand it? Would my uncle understand it? Would my grandpa, may he rest in peace, understand it? Would people with no stats background understand my story? And if they do, well, I'm set because everybody else will follow me. But I want to make sure that the lowest common denominator, they follow along. Let's keep going. Factor analysis. This is another example. Factor analysis. What is a factor analysis? I know I have some of my MSBA students in the audience, some of my MBA students. I know you guys have studied this. The question is, do you remember this? I'm sure many of you do. So, a story about a factor analysis. So, you may be interested as the brand manager of Starbucks to understand how people perceive your brand. You may want to look at brand personality traits. Is Starbucks cool? Is it sexy? Is it fun? Is it interesting? Is it environmental? Is it angry? Is it loud? Is it sophisticated? Is it liberal? Is it trendy? Well, as you might imagine, in a survey, you might have a list of some 30, 40, or 50 different kinds of brand personality traits. Is this a lot? Oh my goodness, yes it is. That's quite a lot. It would be great if we could group the individual brand personality items that vary together. Meaning that people who say that Starbucks is liberal also tend to say that it's environmental and it's sophisticated and it's intelligent. If that's the case, then we can kind of shrink down this big list of 50 brand personality traits and shrink it down to maybe a list of 10 brand personality traits that are grouped along, let's say, 3 big groups. So we can say that one group is sophisticated, liberal, environmental, and intelligent. That's just what audiences tend to put down. So audiences tend to put down liberal, sophisticated, intelligent, and environmental. All together, they tend to. So that seems to be one pattern, right? That people who say that Starbucks is liberal or Starbucks is environmental tend to also put down intelligent and sophisticated. Those personality traits tend to vary together. And there might be 2 other groups. That's a factor analysis. A factor analysis takes a big list of items, shrinks it down, and groups the items together that vary together, that are similar to each other, that go up and down together. People who tend to think Starbucks is really sophisticated also tend to put down that it's really liberal, it's environmental, and it's intelligent. Additionally, people who tend to say that Starbucks is not liberal also tend to say that it's not environmental, it's not sophisticated, and it's not intelligent. This is very useful because this allows us to reduce big lists of indicators and turn them into composite or combined variables. So those 3 groups that I mentioned for factor analysis allow us to do linear regression, which we just went through. We can treat one of these groups as an independent variable and do other things. Additionally, we can also use these factor analyses to get a better sense of what future surveys should look like. The next survey that we do, the next brand tracker that we do, shouldn't have 50 items. Maybe it should have those 3 groups, the one being the sophisticated, liberal, environmental, intelligent group, because a lot of people seem to think that of Starbucks. And so what we can do is month to month, we can send out a brand health tracker, just a questionnaire asking people month to month what you think of the Starbucks brand. And if those personality traits are important to us, we can track how they go up and down or how they vary month to month. So you can see here I was able to explain what a factor analysis is, how I defined it, why it's useful. And I would use the story of brand personality traits because everybody has their own perceptions of Honda, Wells Fargo, Dunkin' Donuts, the New York Knicks, New York Yankees, any kind of brand that you can imagine, Armani, Kenneth Cole. We all have different perceptions. Coach, Gucci, Mercedes-Benz. And so everybody has perceptions of brands. Everybody has perceptions of personalities. We all have personalities, I hope, And so we're able to think about, well, yeah, like, my friend is fun, she's kind of conservative, she's interesting, she's energetic. Yeah, I could totally see how some people might think of that of a brand. I definitely think that of Honda. I can follow Anthony's example. I can follow this example. This makes sense to me. I'm not familiar with factor analysis, but I can move along. Anthony hasn't forgotten me. And this is really good because, again, this is the beginning of your presentation. You want to be sure you bring people along. Let's keep going. So I'd like to wrap this up with a study that I had done a few years ago. It's entitled Consumer Personalities and Lifestyles at the Box Office and Beyond: How Demographics, Lifestyles, and Personalities Predict Movie Genre and Movie Platform Consumption. And so in this study, I have a structural equation model. I have a structural equation model, and it is useful in showing relationships between demographics, lifestyles, and personalities, and how they predict movie genre and movie platform consumption. The issue being, I did all of this in a structural equation model, which again is quite a mouthful. And I anticipate that most audience members won't have a clue regarding what I'm talking about. I don't want them to be left behind. So there might be a few things that I can do. Let's keep going. So I have my descriptive results here. These are easy enough to showcase. The first thing you should always do in a statistical method defense is you should present descriptive results, explain to people what your population sample was, why it works, why it makes sense, why it is representative. And so I have about a 50-50 gender split. The participant age was fairly dispersed across all life stages, and 37% of participants earned incomes of $60,000 or more. And I kind of had great variation across political affiliation. Race and ethnicity was roughly representative of the US Census as well. These are things that are critical because you want to mention them to ensure that audiences understand that you're doing everything in a very methodical manner. Let's keep going. Preliminary lifestyle factor analyses. This is one way to show a factor analysis. I present them a bit clearer than I did a few years ago, but nonetheless, it's important to bring people along for the ride. So if you want to be transparent, you can show people what each factor analysis is about. You can see next to each factor, I've included the Cronbach's alpha score. That's for people in the audience who are interested in it. You can always point those out to people and say this is a reliability score that say that these indicators vary together. It's reliable, it's replicable, and so it's an assured scale. And you can see that I've defined all of these indicators. Let's keep going. I did the same thing for personality here. And so, again, you can go as in-depth as you want to with these, but it's up to you. It's up to you. I think this is a nice way of doing it because you kind of show the results, but it's in a very attractive manner, and it's in a very fun manner as well. Let's keep going. Structural equation modeling, the explanation for it. This aids us in understanding relationships. Variables interact with each other, but to what extent? And we also know that variables interact with each other simultaneously. Do 3 independent variables, sunlight, weather, wind level, influence one dependent variable? The amount of clothes worn by a consumer. If so, is it possible to look at these relationships simultaneously to see which independent variable is most powerful? Structural equation modeling, SEM, allows for looking at multiple variables and their relationships simultaneously. So in the at the beginning of this lecture, I was talking about multiple linear regression. Multiple linear regression looks at each variable isolated, each independent variable isolated in its predictiveness with a dependent variable. Differently, with the structural equation model, all relationships are tested simultaneously. It is a stronger, more assured method that ensures that when we have something statistically significant, it is in fact so. Let's keep going. So what is structural equation modeling? This method combines multiple statements or questions regarding a variable, could be consumer responses about personalities, into one combined variate, personalities, let's say. Or in our brand personality example, we had that liberal, intelligent, environmental, sophisticated factor loading that was produced from the factor analysis. Independent variates are used to measure dependent variates. So structural equation modeling seeks to create a model to highlight relationships among variables based on a data set. There's a greater sense of causality. You're really able to gain greater confidence in thinking that X in fact influences Y. It ensures true understanding of notable relationships. It avoids type 1 error. It avoids thinking that you have some sort of statistically significant relationship when in fact you don't. Estimates above 30 illustrate that for every 1 unit change in an independent variable, the dependent variable will increase 0.30. So I've tried to walk through the model here. I've shown different instances of why SEM works, greater sense of causality. We're more sure that we have something statistically significant. We're able to find patterns better. Again, we're trying to shoot for the lowest common denominator, and granted, even trying to explain structural equation modeling is a mouthful. But we're getting there. Let's keep going. So, raw structural equation model indicators are informed in color, and relationships are informed in black. And so here, I'm trying to show what each composite variate is comprised of. And so we can see here for personalities, the factor analysis produced a group of personality traits called unfocused. It produced a group of personality traits that I called reliable. It produced a group of creative personality traits that I labeled creative. And I took those 3 groups and I combined them into personalities. We can see the same here for the other composite variates. And so this is a nice visual just to help people along, because a model often makes people hit the snooze button, even if they're not near their alarms. We want to be sure at this point we're not losing anybody. Yes, I am showing a model to people, but I don't want to bore them. I'm very concerned about that. Let's keep going. All individual relationships, black arrows, were found to predict variation in corresponding dependent variable. For instance, movie genre and movie platform. And so we can see here, I've explained what these betas mean. I can show the statistical significance. If I need to go through p-value, I can. I don't have to, but I can. But if we go back to the last slide, I can go back here anytime I need to go to the next slide. And so we can have this conversation of, oh, what was in movie genre? I can click back, and there it is. Crime, horror, mystery, drama. That's what I accounted for. Let's go to the next slide. And so here, this is, yet again, a different way of showing structural equation model. This is the same model. It's the same model. I've replaced the ovals with images. Maybe this is more interesting. Maybe this is easier for my audience to understand because they really don't care about the stats. And that's okay. It's not a big deal. You know the science behind the numbers, and you're self-assured. How personalities, lifestyles, and demographics predict movie genre frequency consumption and movie platform frequency consumption. Personalities and lifestyles predicted movie genre consumption frequency, fine. Lifestyles and demographics predicted movie platform frequency consumption, fine. Recommendation, movie theaters should measure external consumer information alongside internal movie consumption tracked by loyalty card databases. That was the crux of this study, that loyalty card programs were not really capturing a lot of consumer data. When you sign up for a Regal or AMC movie card, like a loyalty card, the websites didn't collect a lot of information. What this is to say is there's a lot of room to start collecting for other things. And that's what we have here. That's what we have here. And so we can see here that if we go back a slide, and if we go back another slide, we can see there are different ways to represent a model. This is effective. Let's go to the next slide. This is a bit more simplistic, but still effective. Let's go to the next slide. This is probably the most effective. People want to get in and out. Treat your business presentation like being in a fast food restaurant. Not to the point that you're not explaining things well, but you don't want to create confusion. Audiences can clearly see this and they can move on quickly. Let's keep going. This is how it appeared in the publication that I had. And so we can see here that this, yet again, is another way of doing it, but this also assumes having a doctoral level audience, or at least a grad student audience, that are familiar with all of the different measurements and other things that are incorporated into structural equation modeling. Let's keep going. And so what assumptions did I have here? And this is a nice way to really close out this lecture. What assumptions did I make here in making all of these charts? For one, I didn't think people would be able to remember all the variates produced by the factor analyses. There's no way. That's why I had that chart that had all of the different factor analyses produced by lifestyles and personalities. Nobody's going to remember all that. I went through them individually, but nobody was going to remember that. And I didn't want people to feel stupid for not remembering it. That's terrible. I figured people would struggle with directional relationships. So I wanted to make sure that I had arrows going from variate to variate, just so that people could follow what I was discussing. I also figured people would be bored by looking at a model, so I wound up using icons and images. I figured some people would desire to see statistically significant results, hence the p-values and the stars next to the numbers. When we begin to have these anticipations for our audience, we begin to have a greater sense of what they may want and how they may walk away from our presentation. In wrapping up this lecture, it's really important to think about, where is my audience before this presentation? Where are they after? Have I confused anybody? In the middle of this particular sandwich, if you will, it's also critical to think about, how have I begun this business presentation? Am I assured of the statistical technique? Am I confident enough in explaining it? Can I explain it in a very simple way? And can I showcase it in a manner that's engaging? Using color, icons, images, such that we don't need to be burdening our audiences with so many numbers. If you really want to put in eigenvalues and incremental values and absolute values and things like that, you can always put that stuff in the appendix. But in a business presentation, you don't want to get hung up too much on statistics if you don't need to. This will allow you to cover the other portions of the presentation that are a bit more germane to your audience. While you and I may geek out on statistical methods, most people don't. But most people need to understand why they're important. And I think that's the difference that a lot of people tend to forget. It's not important that we convince other people to geek out on what we geek out on, but it is important to convince people why they're important. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.